Just 1 minute. I'm waiting for it to go live on YouTube. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry, the program at the start has got a bit delayed because we had some technical glitches. We are now back on the air. Uh, this BIC session, Talking South Asia, is in collaboration with the South Asian Symphony Foundation. This evening, we have Ambassador Menon Rao, who will be speaking to musician Ali Sethi, and we thank SASF for doing this event along with BIC. Over to you, Ambassador Menon Rao.
Thank you, Ravi, and good evening to all those who are watching this program. Ali Sethi, welcome to this conversation jointly by the Bangalore International Center and the South Asian Symphony Foundation. We are a not-for-profit trust dedicated to building connectivity between musicians of South Asia and the South Asian diaspora through creation of a South Asian Symphony Orchestra, which we call Chirag. Now, South Asia is a region, as we know, fraught with more than its share of conflict and alienation. I recall Simon Sharma saying recently that the world has built a romance around division. But turning to music, I think it can provide a healing and integrative touch and make a difference. With it, concepts like exploration and discovery take on a new meaning. Ali, you were brought up in the city of Lahore, where you finished school and then headed to Harvard University, where you focused on South Asian studies, and where you also decided that you would build your future in music. I think music is a wonderful way to make sense of the world, and the musician is an integrating figure. So welcome again, and do tell us about delving deep into South Asian literature and history at Harvard. Our Indian audience, at least, will be interested to know you studied Tamil Sangam poetry, read Shakuntala and poems in praise of Shiva, and that you are a devoted fan of the great A.K. Ramanujan, who, as you know, hailed from Mysore, a city that is not far from where we are here in Bangalore. So welcome again, and let's start the conversation. Thank you for being here. You're in New York under lockdown, just as we are. I wish we could have had a chai pe charcha face to face, but this is the best we can do.
One day soon, inshallah, as we say. Well, thank you for organizing this, Ambassador Menon. This is really wonderful, and I really feel that you know, more conversations need to happen across South Asian identities, nationalities, markers of difference. You quoted Simon Sharma. I agree. I find it very strange that we in South Asia, especially given our very, very rich, interesting tapestries of cultural, linguistic, even emotional, and ontological connection, we're kind of so fixated on difference. I think, you asked me how did I come to read Ramanujan, Shakuntala and the Ring of Recollection, the sort of classical Tamil poetry in translation, etc. And I guess the one element in your question that I should explicitly point out is that as a Pakistani, how did I come to read all of this stuff? Because the assumption, which is, I think, largely true, is that, Pakistan, if you grow up in Pakistan like I did, you're bereft of this South Asian education in many ways. Even a traditional quote unquote Indo-Muslim, education has now been kind of marginalized in favor of a kind of bureaucratic colonial sort of version of things. So I grew up reading these, at school, these Pakistan studies textbooks that gave us a really rather rushed and uninspiring kind of version of history. There was an attempt to kind of draw this sometimes implicit and at other times explicit line, between scattered events throughout history in order to justify what was then called the two-nation theory. And I'm kind of amazed to see today that the two-nation theory, in Pakistan at least, is being justified by saying, oh, well, look at what's happening in India today, of course we needed two nations, etc. So one grew up with this rhetoric of two nations, and this rhetoric of things were framed, in terms of the national constantly. And yet, I think through language and through music, the music that I grew up listening to, my parents have been, dissenting voices within Pakistan, the Pakistani media for a long time. And, one of the things that my mother did, which I'm really grateful for, is that she really exposed us, as when my sister and I were children, to a lot of traditional South Asian music. So we grew up listening to Qawwali and to Ghazal and to, folk music from Punjab and from the Saraiki belt and from Sindh. And we also grew up listening to Pandit Bhimsen Joshi. We also grew up listening to, the great bhajan singers, etc. It was all part of one musical landscape. And I think through those other sort of perspectives, through those other experiences, one was able to have an alternative sense of a South Asian identity. It was not until I arrived at Harvard, which was in 2002, September 2002, so exactly 1 year after 9/11. And I remember that there was a kind of, this was right before, Facebook was made in my dorm by my classmate, Mark Zuckerberg. So, there was very little quote unquote connectivity in the world at the time. If you wanted to delve into into the history of the region, you really had to go to the library. You couldn't look it up on JSTOR, for example. So I remember being haunted by this question, what does it mean to be Pakistani? What does it mean to come from an Indo-Muslim context? Where do you draw your sense of identity, your genealogy? How do you make that shajara, as we say? What do you include and what do you exclude? So these questions became, I think, kind of sharpened for me in America in that post 9/11, immediately post 9/11 context. This question of, and there were a lot of young South Asian Muslims in my class in my year who were also, I think, asking these questions. So I found my answer the first year of college when I went and auditioned for the South Asian Association's annual variety show called Ghungru, which is the musical. Now it's become this, annual extravaganza. It was fun, but it was, I think, a more modest event then. So I went and auditioned, and I sang a little bit of a ghazal, and I got in, and then I performed for the first time on a stage. I'd grown up sort of singing and practicing, etc. But in Lahore, I'd never had the opportunity because at my school there was no classical music society or no forum for performance. So when I performed at Ghungru, all the way in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I think for the first time I had that sense of kind of wholeness. The idea that a ghazal, in this scholarly environment, could give me a kind of way into my heritage, and also a way to convey to people where I was coming from that felt right.
Wonderful. And you're right about monolithic concepts of identity. I think the world is essentially following divergent paths today. When you think of globalization and the interconnectedness that it was supposed to have brought about, and you see the contrast and this contradiction. And that is where I believe art and aesthetics and, trying to disengage the divergent from that which is universal, which is essentially what we spoke about now. And that creating that balance, as somebody said, between head and heart and stomach, which is absent. So when you speak of creating this community of identity, this civilizational coherence, as it were, then I believe that music can be that bridge builder, which
absolutely,
I think when you song Chandni Raat is, it was just the evening, it happened last week.
Yes.
And you spoke about the number of messages that crowded in on YouTube from both sides of the border that spoke about peace and love and tolerance. And at some stage in one of your interviews, I couldn't help but noticing this, that you define peace as a sense of loss, as a sense of vulnerability. I think that was a very, very interesting definition because, I was reminded also of Beethoven when he spoke of peace on high, peace to serve. I think essentially what we're trying to do through this attempt to craft a South Asian identity through the medium of music. And music in some ways, I mean, I'm not using the term in the literal sense of the word. Music in a way, like Edward Said said, can be subversive also.
Yes, absolutely.
You have yourself referred to this in one of your past interviews. Let's talk about that.
So I think, I think there was this sort of binary opposition between tradition and modernity always growing up. And I'm sure you can relate to that as well. I think it's something that post-colonial societies have grappled with constantly and still do. I think this question of, do you adhere to the values and the ideas that were ostensibly passed on by your forebears, by your ancestors, or do you break? There's no other. I mean, for a lot of us, it's been framed like that. You either break with the past, or you forego modernity, whatever that means. And I think what I found through traditional music, through my sort of immersion in and engagement with South Asian forms of folk music and classical music, is that this wonderful paradox, which is that you find through these quote unquote traditional things, genuinely radical, freeing, subversive, cosmopolitan, sort of experimental worldviews. You arrive at these moments that today, actually, these moments in history that today feel so unlikely and far-fetched, given how polarized we've become and how ossified our sense of identity has become. I'll just give you an example, and now when having trained with Ustad Nasiruddin Sami of the Delhi Gharana, who migrated as a child from Delhi to Karachi, having trained with someone like Farida Khanum, who was born in Calcutta and grew up in Amritsar and then came to Rawalpindi and then to Lahore at partition. When I listen to a ghazal or when I listen to a qawwali, ostensibly, Pakistani musical forms or ostensibly Indo-Muslim musical forms, I see in them elements of Turkic musical culture. I see elements of, pre-Islamic Indic culture. I see elements of, then very specific regional inflections. I hear a Begum Akhtar. I hear I hear Carnatic inflections. I know that the ragas that have traveled from the south to the north and how they've been adapted. I can hear Sindh. I can hear Persia. I think those just, and then through language as well, through the lyric that these songs are sung in, and then the mythology. This is where someone like A.K. Ramanujan was such an aid to me, was that, he allowed me to see the continuities and the connections, it was like an echo chamber, the world of South Asian mythology and folklore. So I think just that coherence came about as a result of this synthesis between text, subtext, context, and then the music, which gives voice to all of those elements.
Yes, I really think that this area which we all belong to, the subcontinent, has always been known for its capacity to assimilate.
Yes.
And, you know, it's not antagonistic to foreign influence. That has never been. And it's found a way to reinvigorate itself through this process of assimilation, which is really what escapes those who would prefer to define things in terms of that monolith that you spoke about. The other day,
I find it so interesting. I was just going to say to you, just a little footnote, you know, to kind of further this, is that it's such a kind of beguiling paradox that, you know, so much of, for example, what I know of as the Vedic religion was kind of formed in territory that today falls within Pakistan, right? And when I hear the ancient ragas, when I hear Malkons, or when I hear Durga, when I hear Shankara, when I hear Hindol, when I hear those ragas, and the way my teacher has explained to me the kind of inflections and the modulations, you know, you can sense the deities being conjured up through these ragas, and you can also sense the arrival of a people, you know, who are kind of forming their identity. I think that's, for me, what is so exciting, is that I can see identity formation, or at least feel it myself. I can sense it through these musical devices. And then to see people kind of treat them as these orthodox, rigidly, you know, kind of museumized things that dare not be, you know, opened up to interaction, immersive kind of encounters, feels to me like such a travesty. The same is true of you know, Sufi text. You know, so many Sufi poems have become kind of situated in these narrowly revisionist, you know, framed by nationalism. Like someone like Iqbal, for example, who I think has so many interesting, subversive, edgy, you know, sort of unstable poems that can lead you any which way depending on your inclination.
From the Quran to Heidegger to the Vedas.
Absolutely, all of it. And you know, and then of course Iqbal is connected to someone like, I mean, this is the similar sort of milieu to someone like Rabindranath Tagore. We're talking about that very large, expansive worldview in which
I know,
these people.
Tagore's phrase for that was the Advaita of humanity. That was used, you know, used a Hindu term, spoke of this universalist, that you are in me and I am in you. You know, that was his concept.
Exactly. So I think Ajkal, as we say, you know, kind of finding that we live in a world where we are ostensibly super connected or hyper connected via these physical technologies. But I like to say that this technology of the heart, which is this heart-mind knowledge, right, which is our particular subcontinental combine of lyric and music, this technology of the heart, we're not activating sufficiently to, you know, generate those profound meanings.
That's right. And it's that emotive knowledge that should underscore the fact that we are one extended family.
Right.
You know, it's really that concept of that undivided joint family. Today we are divided.
And that within a joint family, as we know, there are profound differences of perspective and opinion and jhagda and all the rest of it, you know. But there's also
live on, you know.
Absolutely. But there ought to be ways of, as my teacher, Professor Ali Asani says, he says, you know, doing dialogue across difference. That is what so many of these, certainly the Bhakts and the Sufis, marshal these forms in order to do dialogue across difference.
That's right.
You know.
That's right. When you speak of Ali Asani, you know, I admire his work very much, and particularly, you know, that subject he treated at length in his PhD thesis about the Ginans, or the Jinn. I mean, forgive me if I'm not pronouncing it properly, but it's based on the Sanskrit word jnana, or, you know, knowledge and awareness. And words like the Bhuj Niranjan, now it's a Sanskrit sounding, Indic sounding word. And it's essentially, the Bhuj Niranjan is a collection of poetry and what you would call bhajans in India, but
Right.
sacred poetry, which was used by the Khwaja Ismailis, you know, and
Right.
for devotional song and poetry. And, you know, you have poems like Imam Ali, for instance, being called the Na Kalanki. Now, Na Kalanki means blemishless. And it's also the name that we use for many Hindu deities. You know, when you
Right.
talk about the avatars of Vishnu,
Right.
I mean,
Right.
you always associate the blemishless one, the pure
Right.
one.
Right.
In a sense, the people of the subcontinent embraced these concepts in a very borderless way, let me say. And when the British came along, when you had colonial rule and governance, then it became a question of categorizing people, you know, what religion you
Right.
belong to, where you
Right.
are from, linguistic and ethnic distinctions. All that comes into existence in the near modern period of our history. And then that, of course, has created so many repercussions for what we are today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've now, I think, sort of alighted on one particular aspect of this, precisely the process of kind of narrowing, progressive narrowing, if you will, that has happened in our sort of, you know, imaginations over the years. I've alighted on this one thing, one aspect, which is metaphor. I feel that you know, one of our great devices for doing dialogue across difference has been metaphor. The metaphors that we have used and that we continue to use in so much of our popular music. You know, I mean, I was just doing a live session on Instagram a few days ago, and I was humming something in Rag Bageshwari, and it just occurred to me that wonderful song from the film Khamoshi, Tum Pukar Lo, you know.
Yeah.
That Hemant Kumar has sung, and that Gulzar Saab wrote the lyrics for. And I just said to this person I was talking to that, you know, I was about 10 years old, and I remember that my grandmother, my nanny, played this song in a car. We were driving somewhere where there were mountains, and I remember my soul awakening, you know, to the sense of just this kind of this larger perspective, this sense that one was in, and of course being around mountains helped, but it was the fact that Gulzar wrote in such a sort of richly metaphorical way,
Right.
you know, gesturing at multiple realities, at multiple dreams, at multiple emotional states through a single capacious image that can carry all those different experiences.
Those
You know, and
yeah.
absolutely. And then you read someone like Amir Khusro, who's the master of the metaphor, you know, and who uses metaphor, symbol, allegory, who takes the voice of the Birahini, you know, who takes all the tropes of the Radha Krishna saga, and is able to gesture also at sort of incorporate these sort of Muslim, you know, devotional perspectives, experiences into that. When you hear something like Aaj Rang Hai, which is that famous Qawwali, Rima Rang Hai Ri, you know,
Yes.
Rang is such a, I mean, one thinks of, you know, scripture that Muslims recite, one thinks of, you know, the whole Sufi Dargah Mahal, one thinks of vermilion in a part, you know, there's so
Yes.
much that is evoked simultaneously. One of my other teachers at college was the wonderful literary critic James Wood. And I remember that he has this beautiful phrase somewhere. He's describing Virginia Woolf. I think he's describing To the Lighthouse, and he says there is a flashing simultaneity, right, that happens as you read, which is a beautiful phrase. And I've always felt that with Sufi Bhakti metaphor in particular, is that it allows us to have this sense of simultaneity, you know,
Yes.
which is that this applies to me and I feel it very, very acutely, but I'm also suddenly aware while having my particular subjective experience that there are other subjectivities that are being evoked as well. And I think today, in the era of identity politics, when we're all trying to figure out in this kind of vectoral way how we're going to do dialogue across difference, one of the great sort of, you know, underlooked kind of strategies is metaphor. I think poetic metaphor, especially for South Asians, really does allow us to do this dialogue, which is, I think, what happened with Chandni Raat, is that here was this ghazal about, you know, a sort of half-lit meeting.
That's right.
And just the timing, it just so happened that the video came out 2 days after the last sort of major conflagration that had happened between India and Pakistan, and people immediately kind of treated it almost like a safe space, to a place to congregate, a place to gather, a place to find shelter, and a place to do dialogue. So that was, I felt.
When you look at the video of the song, and I think it was the way it's been shot, the way it was picturized, and that whole, rather spare and stark space with a lot of people gathering there, people who look vacant, who look lost, who are strangers essentially.
Right.
And to me, that was a metaphor of South Asia itself,
Right.
the way we are in a single geographical space, an integer, as I always say, sharing the same weather patterns, the same climate, climate change, the poverty, the lack of development, the lack of connectivity. And how and we are strangers to one another. There are stereotypes and prejudices.
Right.
Somehow that became a metaphor to me of how we are trying to create our orchestra in many ways, people coming together. And one point that always comes to mind is the art of listening. We have lost that art of listening. And
absolutely.
That the act of listening is itself an act of love.
Absolutely.
When we learn to listen to each other. And that song somehow led me into that chain of thought, as it were, where I began to think about how creating, this band of musicians, people coming together. I hope at some stage you will have an opportunity to perform with our orchestra also. I really hope. And in fact, looking at the Ginans and, Professor Asani's work, I hope we can commission an orchestral piece based on this, which we can perform together. And because, East meets West, we are essentially taking a Western concept, which is a symphony, into a region which is so fraught with conflict and with division. And we're trying to look outside ourselves. In fact, taking Asia out of South Asia into some wider space, but yet bringing South Asia to the world also.
Right.
So I wish we could do that. The other point that you mentioned about ambiguity and about folklore and about the ghazal. And the Germans have, a term, they talk of Natur poetry, that is natural poetry, poetry that comes out of lullabies and what mothers sing to babies, and Kunst poetry, which is very more artificial, more worked on, more ornamentalist. But in South Asia, somehow these two seem to come together. When I think of, I'm from Kerala, deep south, and there's so much of folkloric music there. There's Hindu music, there's Muslim music, and they all, have coexisted together and created something, truly symbiotic of a region that's always been open to the world. So I would the need for openness, because the tragedy of a closed mind, is the worst.
Right. I mean, it's one of the things that sort of occurs to me is that, so much of when we perform so much Punjabi devotional kalam is performed using varieties of rag Bhopali, which is now called Bhopali somehow. It's pronounced Bhopali, which makes you think it's from Bhopal or has some connection with the state of Bhopal. These are some of the quirkier aspects of, sort of the traveling of words and sounds and things and approximations. So my ustad pointed out to me, he said in Urdu, he said, "Beta, ye Karnataka se aaya hai humko," right? So the idea that this pentatonic, beautiful raga has traveled from Carnatic music into the music of the North. And then, of course, listening to versions of varieties of that same sort of melodic framework within Carnatic music, led me to this whole other journey, which was, the Kerala and the coast of South India was in touch with Arab traders even before the advent of Islam. And of course, we now know that the Indus Valley civilization was probably in touch with Mesopotamia as well. So, even our ideas of Hindu and Muslim actually don't sufficiently encapsulate or encompass the cultural connections and the possible, what you say, the openness that has been a central aspect of South Asian life since the beginning of time as we know it.
That's why I think communalism is a very, important concept in a sense, and a more recent phenomenon in our region, because, when I talked of the adaptiveness and the capacity to assimilate and the kind of border way in which we tended to look at daily life and the transaction, I mean, the social contract in many ways.
Right.
That tended to break down, I believe, which is a tragedy for all of us. And that is why I think when you look at South Asia and you look at this vast space, almost the size of a continent, we are not able to achieve the potential that, that is in us, that we have that strength. And, that humanitarian quality. And I think politics, the everyday has become politicized in many ways, politicize the everyday. That's the slogan for our times. And, when you think of Sakyamuni, the Buddha, 2,500 years ago, also from the same region, and the humanitarianism that he preached, and the definition of what compassion is. I think, do we really, we talk of deterrence, let's say, nuclear deterrence. Do we ever talk of resilience, which is something that's so native to us as a people? Otherwise,
absolutely,
through all this. And you once mentioned your guru Farida Khanum saying that dard, I don't know if you would call it pain or alienation or being externed in some ways, is the greatest gift of life. I was quite intrigued by that. Is it that we learn to live with pain, that we carry it on our shoulders, that it becomes some kind of a rucksack on our backs, as it were? Are we sort of destined to this? Is it our natural inheritance?
I mean, I will actually give my version of the answer and then ask you the same question, because so what Farida ji said to me was, I mean, she would repeatedly say this. We were practicing, I was trying to get this, understand the Tumri Baju Band Khul Khul Jai, in Bhairavi Rag, and how to kind of, how to say it really, the accent, the ang, as we say, kis ang mein kehna hai, how do we, and we were kind of, she's a wonderful host. So one of the great challenges of studying music with her is that there's always something to eat and some chai and some wonderful sort of, distraction is always available. And she's constantly gesturing and saying, chalo kuch khao, chalo kuch chai piyo, pani piyo, samosa chakho, vagara. So
like
in the middle of it,
like all South Asian mothers.
I know, right? It's a terrific way to be spoiled for choice. So she said to me, and I said, Manu, in Punjabi, we communicate and talk to each other in Punjabi. I said, Manu, samajh nahi aa raha, to see kis tarah kya lende ho? How is it that you just effortlessly know how to become this voice, that can say this whole piece, which is rather complex. And, so she said, dard nal kavo na, dard nal kavo, thoda jya. She said, thoda jya dard nal kavo. So just a little. And I think the English words like pain, etc., or affliction even, are inadequate, because of course dard is such an ecstatic kind of delicious.
Maybe the Greek word pathos.
I was going to suggest exactly that. Exactly. So I think pathos is the key, is the way to go at it, and it kind of works in the same way as pathos does, because of course sympathy and empathy, etc., all come from pathos. And so similarly, bedardi and hamdardi also come, sort of, you add on the, so I felt what she was saying was that sense of pathos can be evoked, I think, through all kinds of experiences, right? So separation, which as an American friend of mine who came to see a show of one of my shows, she said, she's this funny American comedian. So she said, no, the beloved is always separated from the lover. Why can't they just get together? And I said to her, well, if they get together, it'll just kill the pleasure of the piece. And she was like, that's what's wrong with you South Asians, is that something has to be wrong always in order for you to just get on with it. But I find that there's a metaphysics at work, obviously. Birha and hijr in Arabic, or hijr or firaq.
Word that says viraha. Viraha, that is, I think that explains, being made distanced, trying to reach out, and Vedana. Vedana, of course, is the pain that you feel because of the
Right.
separation.
Exactly.
It's not physical pain in the sense, I have a stomach ache or a headache.
Right. Exactly.
It's the same word, but then Vedana has so many connotations.
Absolutely. So it's almost like a metaphysical concept. And the idea is that, the Sufis say that ishq majazi will lead you to ishq hakiki. The idea that some sort of worldly experience of love, which is metaphorical in nature, earthly love, will lead you, if you are devoted enough, if you are sufficiently devoted to the pursuit of love, it will lead you to higher truths. And that's sort of exactly what is evoked with that line, Ranjha Ranjha kardi main aape Ranjha hui. Rab milya Ranjha na milya. Right? So the idea that Ranjha is actually a catalyst or a spur, that the beloved is a chimera, is a chimerical entity that will lead you to other things. And I think this is something that everybody in every culture should be able to relate to, except South Asians have kind of made a whole school of thought out of it. And I think it applies to us in our current kind of political situation as well, where viraha, hijr, firaq, chandni raat badi der ke baad aayi hai, all of that becomes also a metaphor for our endless partitioning,
Exactly.
Our constant kind of chopping up and saying, no, this belongs here and this belongs there. I don't know if you've, sorry, go on.
Dividing the sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but dividing the secular from the sacred, often, there is a pathway that seems to cross, in so many ways, that there are so many sectional, meetings that take place. And we are not meant to compartmentalize that way. That's not the way life is. But
and also this idea that, that one narrative or one identity must be, ascend in the ascendant, or must be hegemonic, or must prevail over others. This is something that is sort of mutantly modern, I feel, this idea, because it has not been, this is not how, people before the era of nationalism, I think, did not think like this. Certainly the poets and intellectuals did not think like this. In none of the work do you find this literalist sort of implementation of identity or pursuit of it. This crisis starts to happen in the colonial period, really, and then kind of just becomes, kind of married to the national project in both countries, and then leads to what we have today, which is really this kind of obsession with, a narrowly national identity that has to exclude, that defines itself by excluding, the other.
Exactly, or scapegoating the other,
Right, or scapegoating the other.
I'm proud of, we're all proud of being what we are, where we come from. That patriotism is not a bad thing at all. I think we should be proud of it. But when it becomes a question of scapegoating the other, then I think it takes on a negative sort of color, let's say. And that's really where I think, as intelligent, sentient human beings, we should, be aware of this. And that's where a good liberal arts education can make such a difference. Our universities need so much of, upgrading and invigorating and, just that's one thing I think we have to learn from better examples elsewhere when it comes to how our education.
I also feel, I would just add to that, while it will probably take us a while to update the syllabi at our universities, given how dominant the kind of right-wing perspective has become in both countries now. The idea that education or formal education is central to the program of building a monolithic nation. Alas, we are all now, those of us who are involved with scholarship or who are involved with critical thinking in any way, we have to confront this almost on a daily basis. I need not give examples of where it happens and how it happens. I think we all know. But I think in the meantime, we can have, a liberal arts education, so to speak, through a musical education, through a kind of discursive, poetic conversation. I think those spaces can also give us these. I mean, I had, sure, I had 4 years of a liberal arts, American liberal arts education at Harvard, but then I had, 12 years of another kind of liberal arts education with my Ustad, Siruddin Sami Saab, and with Farida Ji, this kind of immersive apprenticeship that also awakened me to these very, very beautiful, supple, liberal in a non-Western sense,
Exactly.
perspectives and experiences.
And, when I read your piece on Saadat Hasan Manto, in the New Yorker, and, the story about Kabir weeping, when you refer in that piece, and, Kabir coming back to modern South Asia, let's say, and weeping inconsolably, when he sees the statue of Lakshmi tied up because, somebody is threatening to destroy it. Or, there are militaristic forces saying that even if the people are starving, we will fight, and this makes him weep inconsolably. And that is something we seem to have lost. And, that's why I like that piece of yours on Manto so much. And when he said this, when I think you were quoting from him, that he said, despite my best efforts, I could not dissociate Pakistan from India and India from Pakistan, And that to me became, it's a kind of his epitaph in many ways, I think. And it's still unanswered, even though there may be many voices in both our countries who say, we know that it can never be so. But those who are, embedded in that cultural ethos, understand that there was more than...
It's almost like, I think it's about where you choose to look, really. I mean, you don't even have to go out of your way to retrieve, these so-called connections. They're still all around us. I was just having a Zoom discussion a few days ago in which it occurred to me as I was speaking, so I pointed it out. I said, one of the great privileges of spending time with Farida Khanum ji is that, you get the stories that she tells me while we are practicing. She'll say, is andaz mein kaho. She'll say, ab ye Bengal ka andaz hai, isme kaho. Then she'll say, eh Punjab da andaz hai, andaj kaho. One of the things that is so apparent is that in the world of music, I mean, in the Bollywood music that we hear today, that is the main music of South Asia all over the world, for the diaspora as well as for non-Desis, right? Who think of it as a, I went to buy a blazer for one of my Coke Studio performances in this shop, and this Italian woman, she said, "Oh, you are a Bollywood singer? Oh, I know how to dress. You come here," So, I mean, it's our sort of ambassador form, Bollywood music, for all South Asians, for Bangladeshis, Sri Lankans, Pakistanis, whether we like it or not. Like everywhere we go, people think that we come from the world of Bollywood, But if you think about what Bollywood music is made up of, many of its tropes, many of its techniques are still, coming to us from that very cosmopolitan milieu of Calcutta in the 1920s, of Bombay in the 1930s and 40s. That is where so much was still formed. And the one example that I gave was the other day was that, this PTV, Pakistan Television, still, I just did a program for them about 2 months ago. So I know that they still have this way of filming a musical performance, which is the camera sort of comes at you from this upar se, as we say, right? So it kind of from the box, from the perspective of the box, and then comes down. And there's always this elaborate stage set up, which I think in the rest of South Asia, people may have dispensed with. But PTV still has this very romantic, old world way of filming a musical performance. And there's this painted stage behind. And usually this singer who's kind of dazzling, who's catching the light and dazzling as they move about and they sing. And it occurred to me that this, of course, is the style of the Calcutta theatre, the Parsi theatre of the 1920s, where the great, Patience Cooper and Mukhtar Begum and Agha Hashar Kashmiri, etc., went and set up this essentially, sorry?
Or a Devika Rani, is it?
Devika Rani, Jaddan Bai, the people who, went and set it all up, who were great impresarios and improvisers, who had no issues bringing, bits of Amritsari Boli and bits of, who were immediately imbibing and appropriating ways of dress, ways of manners of speaking, ways of performing, ways of setting up a stage show, etc. So that Calcutta style still survives in PTV, where it may have died out in India, in present-day
We
India.
still have glimpses of it on Doordarshan, which is our,
You
national
still have glimpses of it on
television channel.
Doordarshan.
And in
I'm
fact,
sure. And so,
watching Doordarshan for that reason, because there is a comforting familiarity about it. Maybe I'm old.
absolutely.
Look at it.
And so similarly, I was saying to somebody the other day that young people today in South Asia think of Qawwali as a mainly Pakistani genre, and as a Punjabi genre, right? Because that's just how people have now come to receive it. And that's because of the greatness of Fateh Ali Khasa, because of the way he came to just embody the form. Whereas if you think about it, Nusrat Saab performed actually a niche version, which is a Punjabi version of Qawwali. Qawwali did not originate in Punjab. It originated in Delhi. And, it was associated with Urdu. And if you think about it, until the 1990s, Qawwali was associated, if you think of that song, Tayyib Ali Pyar Ka Dushman Hai Hai, the Qawwal is depicted repeatedly as almost this humorous trope figure in popular culture, with an anak and eating a pan and kind of, with this kind of school teacher sort of aspect. And then Nusrat Saab turns up, and with his particular, eccentric genius, transforms it into this very dynamic, folksy sort of thing that then travels to India and becomes now no Bollywood film is complete without an ishka, ishka, ishka sort of like song with claps and with kind of with that Qawwali genre. But very few people will make that connection and sort of see how something went from Delhi to Punjab and then came back via, popular film music back into the mainstream. I think if we just sort of pay attention to these connections, we will immediately see how, despite our constant dividing of things into this is Indian, this is Pakistani, this is Punjabi, this is, Dehlvi, etc., or even this is Carnatic and this is Hindustani, there are these connections through poetry and music that allow us to still be very dynamic.
Absolutely. And you talked about the Qawwali tradition. If you go down south to Kerala and just listen, if you can, on YouTube or one of these channels, to the Muslims of Kerala are called Mapilas. And the Mapila wedding songs you should listen to. They're very much like
I would love to. I don't think I've heard them.
Beautiful songs, and I hope they will inspire you to perhaps compose.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
Which is that what is it like to be? I'm fascinated by this. What is it like to bring a South Asian sensibility to the art of the symphony, which to my mind is such a quintessentially Western, European sort of space. What has it been like?
Well, it's been like this. First of all, I think what I felt we needed to do, since I'd worked in diplomacy, literally been in the trenches, seen the I felt that there was a big wall of prejudice, of stereotyping, and we were incommunicado in many cases. So just getting people to develop habits of cooperation. So, Western Symphony entails that you have to sit down, you share a desk, as it's called, with somebody else. He or she may be a stranger, but you bring your passion for music. You inculcate with that passion a sense of discipline. And you're able to, as I said, the art of listening, you begin to become more sensitive to the need to listen to the other. You may be playing a trumpet and however loud your trumpet is, it's not going to sound all right unless it is able to calibrate its sound.
Right.
So this is where the powerful and the less powerful come in. We have to learn to synchronize. So I felt that from the Western Symphony construct would help us in the South Asian context. But I didn't want to stop there, because I felt that, in terms of the oeuvre, the kind of work that we were going to use as for our programming, as it were, while we would play Western pieces, we would begin to build a body of work which is South Asian, but which is suitable to be played by a Western orchestra. So in a sense, bringing that South Asian identity, awareness among ourselves, but also bringing it to the world. So in the two concerts that we've done, we made a piece. I would say we made, it's not essentially composed. We took 7 songs from the 8 countries of the region, from Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka. We couldn't get one from the Maldives, maybe we will. And we made a piece called Hum Safar. We called it Hum Safar. And we used very popular, mainly folk, but some, nationally known songs from each of these countries. From Pakistan, we had Damadam, in fact, Mast Kalandar. And from India, the person who arranged it took Mera Juta Hai Japani, in fact, the very famous Raj Kapoor song. From Bangladesh, we took a Tagore song, Allah Megh De. I mean, the words, and the Bangladeshi song that Allah Megh De. And similarly, a Nepalese and Bhutanese folk song. And from Sri Lanka, we took a song about 2 brothers and the feud between them, and how they think about their childhood and, bemoan their current fate. So we made a beautiful piece, and when it was launched, when it was premiered last April at the National Center for the Performing Arts in Mumbai, we not only had the Western instruments, South Asians playing Western instruments, but we also had Kashmiri and Afghan musicians on the stage with their traditional instruments, with santoor and with the chumbak nari, and many of those, traditional instruments. So we created that confluence. So it's about creating confluence. It's about creating a communication. It's about creating coherence that the rest of the world can also relate to. So
absolutely. I think that's beautiful, and there's such an overlap in what you say, between what you say and kind of what I've been feeling lately. I don't know if you've seen, but we did a series of spontaneous Instagram live sessions.
I saw that.
Yeah, and then we were kind of
sing also before we close. I think, I'm sure.
Yes, we must. I was gonna. Can I sing a little bit of this? So we were. I mentioned Rag Bhopali to you, which is a wonderful, beautiful raga, and I've composed this song and written a lot of it also. I took a couplet from Shakil Badayuni, the Urdu poet. And in fact, I tampered with the couplet. I took the first half of the couplet, the first line, and then wrote the second half of the sher, and sat with a lyricist in Lahore and composed the whole song. And used, began in Bhopali and then traveled into the space of what is called Shuddha Kalyan. The sort of a very beautiful devotional raga that evokes, I think, romance as well as the devotional.
Kalyani in the Carnatic.
I think so. I think yes. I think yes. And
so
and
in Sanskrit means benevolence.
There you go. It means benevolence. Yeah. And of course, there's also Yaman, which is also sometimes called Aman. And there's a variety of Yaman called Yaman Kalyan.
Yeah.
Also called Aman Kalyan, which combines Kalyan and Aman, and So with ragas too, we see this dialogue right across categories. They're not quite. They are entirely themselves, but they also are able to communicate to one another. So this is the words are in Urdu. Ishq ki chingariyon ko phir hawa dene lage. Ishq ki chingariyon ko phir hawa dene lage. And then I completed it thus: Gum hue jo raste mera pata dene lage.
Okay, I'm able to recognize the pathways again.
Right. So the idea that this wonderful collaborator, friend of ours, Sri Lata Srikar, sent in an English translation, a poetic translation. Embers of my longing have been flamed again. Embers of my longing have been flamed again. The lost trail remembers the way again. Which I thought was a beautiful, and also a collaboration across borders and difference, because Sri Lata is a translator who works with many Indian South Asian languages. So anyway, I composed this using some of Rag Bhopali as taught to me by Ustad Nasiruddin Sami, and then bits of Shuddha Kalyan. Ijazat hai ji, may I begin?
Absolutely, इजाजत है.
इश्क की चिंगारियों को फिर हवा दे, इश्क की चिंगारियों को फिर हवा दे, गुम हुए जो रास्ते मेरा पता देने लगे, इश्क की चिंगारियों को फिर हवा देने लगे, गुम हुए जो रास्ते मेरा पता दे, इश्क की चिंगारियों को फिर हवा देने लगी.
It's wonderful, beautiful.
Alas, I don't have my tambura or my other instruments, but sort of this is how I feel about music, and what it has given me is that it really has flamed, lit the way for me, and shown me my way, which
Absolutely, and you use the image of lighting, illumination, and that is what our orchestras are. We call our orchestra Chirag, actually.
exactly. There you go. So inshallah, one day I hope that we can
Absolutely, perform together, and the orchestra, is able to provide you the music through that wonderful voice of yours, and surely, I'm sure when my father would always say, if you're pure of heart, you can achieve what you want. So I think we need
That's
that.
beautiful. Well, thank you. This was super fun. I hope we'll have more opportunities to chat together and to work together.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Across difference, inshallah.
Absolutely. Stay safe and be well. And we will meet in person, I'm sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ali. Thank you, Ambassador Menon Rao. That's absolutely fascinating and amazing. Expansive knowledge and reflective of your combined erudition and humanity. Thank you so much for doing this. And I think it would be fair to say this is one of the highlights of our lockdown programming. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
And for those on the good night, folks, and
good night.
Next BIC event. Thank you.
Good day and good night. Thank you.